welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we'll explore a story that changed an entire state's criminal justice system. A tragedy that should never have happened, involving a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, and the systemic failures that allowed evil to slip through the cracks. This is the story of Reagan Tokes. Reagan Tokes was 21 years old in February of 2017. She was a senior at Ohio State University in Columbus, majoring in psychology. Just 3 months away from graduation, she had grown up in Monclova Township near Toledo, Ohio, in a close-knit family that adored her. Those who knew Reagan described her as vibrant, enthusiastic, someone who embraced life with open arms. She had dreams of helping people, of making a positive impact on the world. Her social media showed a young woman living fully ziplining with friends, exploring new places, laughing, always laughing. She worked 2 jobs to support herself through school. One at a restaurant called Fusion, and another at a bar and cafe called Bodega in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus. The Short North was trendy, artistic, filled with galleries and restaurants. It was the kind of place where young people gathered, where the city felt alive. Reagan was responsible, dependable. She always called her father Toby, always checked in. Her family could set their watches by her communication. She was that consistent, that thoughtful. Wednesday, February 8th, was a normal day. Reagan attended her classes. Later that evening, she went to work at Bodega. Her shift ended around 9:45 at night. She said goodnight to her coworkers, grabbed her things, and walked out into the February cold. She headed toward her car, which she always parked behind the bar on a side street. It wasn't well lit, it was quiet. She was alone. And that's when her life changed forever. But before we continue with Reagan's story, we need to talk about Brian Goldsby. Brian Goldsby was 29 years old in February of 2017. He had just been released from prison 3 months earlier. On November 13th, his criminal history was extensive and deeply disturbing. As a juvenile, he had been assessed by the Ohio Department of Youth Services. The assessment revealed horrifying details. He had sexually assaulted children as young as 5 and 6 years old. He had been involved with gangs. He had a long record of crimes: trespassing, theft, shoplifting, even threatening his own mother with a knife. But it was what happened in November of 2010 that should have kept him behind bars much longer. A woman 8 months pregnant was getting her 2-year-old son out of her car in a Grove City apartment complex parking lot. Goldsby approached from behind. He held a knife to her throat. He threatened her child's life. What followed was a nightmare. Goldsby forced the woman to drive him to multiple ATMs while he assaulted her in front of her toddler. He made her take him to her home, where he assaulted her again and stole her possessions. The charges should have reflected the severity of these crimes: kidnapping, rape, but the victim was terrified. She feared for her life and the lives of her children. She refused to testify, so prosecutors offered a plea deal. Goldsby pleaded guilty to robbery and attempted rape in May of 2011. He received a 6-year sentence, but because he had already spent 6 months in jail awaiting trial, those days counted toward his time. He would actually serve only 5.5 years. 5.5 years for terrorizing a pregnant woman and her child. His time in prison was turbulent. He racked up 52 infractions. He got into fights. One after another inmate mocked him. He defied female corrections officers, specifically using gender-based slurs. He stole. He refused orders. He caused disturbances. He was moved between 5 different prisons because his behavior was so problematic. When he was released in November of 2016, he was classified as a Tier 3 sex offender, the most severe classification. He had to register with the county sheriff every 90 days for the rest of his life. Anyone living within 1,250 feet of him had to be notified. But there was a problem. Because of his violent history and his prison infractions, no halfway house would accept him. He was released homeless. He had no permanent address, no stable housing, no support system. The state's solution: they assigned him to a GPS ankle monitor through a program called Alvis. The monitor would track his movements. In theory, someone would be watching. In theory, he would be supervised. But theory and reality were about to diverge in the worst possible way. Brian Goldsby was wearing that GPS ankle monitor when he walked the streets of Columbus in late January of 2017. No one was watching him closely. There were no exclusion zones programmed into his monitor, no restricted areas he couldn't enter. No one was actively monitoring his movements in real time. The data was just being collected, stored away, essentially meaningless, unless someone chose to look at it. And Goldsby knew he could move freely. Starting on January 23rd, reports began flooding into the Columbus Police Department from the German Village area, a quiet, safe neighborhood about 3 miles from the short north. A woman was assaulted in her garage as she tried to get into her car. A man had entered behind her, his face obscured by a pulled-down hood and a mask. He punched her repeatedly as she fought him off. The next day, January 24th, another woman was leaving her home on Brook Street when a man approached. A knife appeared at her throat. He demanded money. 3 days later, on January 27th, a woman was crossing the street near Children's Hospital after parking her car. She was on her way to work when someone attacked her. The descriptions were consistent. A black male, average height, wearing dark clothing with a hood, pulled low, moving through the shadows, targeting women, always alone. Residents of German Village were terrified. This peaceful community that rarely saw crime was suddenly under siege. One of the victims was 68-year-old Josie Marple. She would later tell police about the moment she walked into her garage and sensed someone there. The figure in the shadows, the face hidden, the sudden violence. Between January 23rd and February 7th, just 2 days before Reagan Tokes was murdered, Brian Goldsby committed 6 armed robberies in South Columbus and German Village, all while wearing a GPS ankle monitor, all while supposedly under state supervision, all while the system that was meant to protect the public did nothing. February 8th, 2017. 9:45 at night. Reagan Tokes left Bodega after her shift. She walked to her car in the dark, quiet side street behind the bar. She was probably thinking about class the next day, or maybe about her upcoming graduation. Maybe she was thinking about calling her dad. Brian Goldsby had been prowling the area since around 9 o'clock that night. GPS data would later show his movements crisscrossing through the neighborhood around Wexner Medical Center, down 5th and High Streets, along Summit Street, checking the side streets east of High. He was hunting. When Reagan reached her car, he was there, waiting. What happened next unfolded over several hours, and the details are almost too horrific to process. Goldsby forced Reagan into her own car. He made her drive to a Chase Bank on South High Street. He forced her to withdraw money from the ATM. For reasons that remain unclear, they drove to other ATMs around Columbus before returning to that same Chase Bank. Reagan withdrew $60 and gave it to him. But taking her money wasn't enough. Somewhere in German Village, in Reagan's car, Goldsby raped her. The GPS data from his ankle monitor placed him there. Later, DNA evidence would confirm it. Then he made Reagan drive south, out of the city toward Grove City. They arrived at Scioto Grove Metro Park shortly before midnight. It was dark, isolated, vast. Goldsby forced Reagan to drive into the park, down near an entrance, into a field. He made her get out of the car. He made her take off all her clothes. Then he forced her to walk into the dark field, her bare feet sinking into the cold mud. According to testimony during the trial, Reagan's last words were, "All I want to do is live." Brian Goldsby shot her twice in the head. He left her body there in the field, naked and alone in the February cold. He took her car, her phone, her purse, her clothes. He drove back to the Columbus neighborhood where he was staying and parked her car on Oakwood Avenue, not far from his residence. Then he waited. Thursday morning, February 9th, just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. A man was driving into Scioto Grove Metro Park when he noticed something in the field. At first, he thought it was a mannequin, something that didn't quite make sense lying there in the open. He stopped his car, he got out to look closer. It wasn't a mannequin. He immediately called 911. Within minutes, police and emergency responders descended on the scene. What they found would haunt them forever. Reagan's body lay in the field where she'd been murdered. She had been shot twice in the head. There was mud on her foot from where she'd been forced to walk to her death. Detective Rick Forney was assigned to the case. He arrived at the scene and immediately knew this was going to be different. The victim was young. The violence was extreme, and there was almost no physical evidence at the scene itself. Reagan's clothes were gone, her purse was gone, her phone was gone, her car was gone. But Reagan was wearing a necklace and had a tattoo that would help identify her. Meanwhile, back at Ohio State, Reagan's roommates and coworkers were worried. Reagan always came home. She always showed up to class. When she didn't come home Wednesday night, they thought maybe she'd stayed with a friend. But when she didn't show up to class Thursday morning and wasn't answering her phone, they knew something was terribly wrong. They filed a missing person report. In Florida, Reagan's parents, Lisa and Toby Tokes, had spent a sleepless night. Reagan hadn't called. That alone was unusual enough to worry them. As the hours ticked by with no word, worry turned to dread. Detective Forney compiled photographs of the victim and her distinguishing features. He went to Ohio State to meet with Reagan's friends. They identified the necklace. They identified the tattoo. It was Reagan. Now came the hardest part. Detective Forney had to call her parents. When Toby and Lisa Tokes answered that call, their worst fears were confirmed. Reagan was gone. Their vibrant, beautiful daughter, who embraced life so fully, murdered. Mackenzie, Reagan's younger sister, didn't have to hear the words. She watched her parents break down during the call. And she knew her life would never be the same. Detectives had a murder scene with almost no evidence. But they had Reagan's car somewhere in Columbus. They just had to find it. Columbus police had installed license plate readers on emergency vehicles throughout the city. These automated systems photographed license plates as emergency vehicles drove their routes. It was this technology that gave them their first break. Reagan's car was located parked on Oakwood Avenue in a residential neighborhood. The same street where just 2 nights earlier, police had been searching for the German Village robbery suspect. Detectives descended on the vehicle. They processed it carefully, methodically. They found fingerprints. They found cigarette butts. They collected DNA samples. They sent everything to the lab and waited. The wait wasn't long. Within 48 hours of non-stop investigation, they got a match. The DNA belonged to Brian Lee Goldsby, a 29-year-old registered sex offender who had been released from prison just 3 months earlier, who was supposedly being monitored, who was supposedly under supervision. Detectives moved quickly. They obtained a warrant for receiving stolen property for being in possession of Reagan's car. At 4 o'clock Saturday morning, February 11th, they arrested Brian Goldsby at his residence. When they questioned him, Goldsby initially denied everything. Then he tried to deflect. He claimed there was another man, someone named TJ, who had forced him to kidnap Reagan for money. He said TJ was the one who shot her. Investigators did a thorough investigation into this mysterious TJ. They found no evidence he existed. The story was fabricated, eventually under the weight of physical evidence. Goldsby's story changed. He provided details about that night that matched what investigators already knew. He gave them information that led them to the murder weapon. The DNA from Reagan's rape kit matched Goldsby. Gunshot residue was found on his sweatshirt. His GPS ankle monitor, the one that was supposed to be keeping the public safe, placed him at every location where Reagan had been that night. Behind Bodega, at the Chase Bank, in German Village, at Scioto Grove Metro Park. The ankle monitor had tracked everything. It just hadn't stopped anything. As the investigation into Reagan's murder progressed, detectives began connecting other dots. They looked at Goldsby's GPS data from the weeks before February 8th. The pattern was unmistakable. His locations matched perfectly with the times and places of the German Village robberies. Victims were contacted. When police showed them Goldsby's photo, identifications were made. DNA evidence linked him to the crime scenes. Brian Goldsby hadn't just murdered Reagan Tokes. In the 3 months since his release from prison, while wearing a GPS ankle monitor that was supposed to be monitoring him. He had committed 6 armed robberies. He had terrorized an entire neighborhood. He had held knives to women's throats. He had beaten them. He had stolen from them. And no one had stopped him. The Adult Parole Authority, which was responsible for his supervision, had failed to monitor his GPS data in real time. His parole officer was overwhelmed with cases and couldn't provide adequate supervision. The halfway house program refused to take him because of his history, but no alternative solution was implemented. Goldsby had even been sanctioned for going AWOL from his temporary housing, and for failing to charge his GPS device. A parole hearing was scheduled to address these violations, but it was set for sometime after February 8th. Reagan Tokes was murdered before that hearing ever took place. If anyone, had been paying attention to the GPS data, they would have seen Goldsby committing robberies in German Village. If someone had enforced the sanctions for his violations, he might have been back in custody. If exclusion zones had been programmed into his ankle monitor, restricting him from certain areas, he might never have been in the short north that night. Instead, the system failed at every level, and Reagan paid the price. Brian Goldsby was indicted on multiple counts: aggravated murder, kidnapping, rape, aggravated robbery, tampering with evidence. The Franklin County prosecutor, Ron O'Brien, announced he would seek the death penalty. The trial began in March of 2018, just over a year after Reagan's death. Jury selection was challenging. The case had received extensive media coverage in Central Ohio. Everyone knew Reagan's name. Everyone knew what had happened to her. Defense attorneys had requested the trial be moved outside Franklin County, but the judge denied the motion. More than 200 prospective jurors were called in an attempt to seat an impartial jury. When the trial began, prosecutors laid out the evidence methodically. They walked jurors through the timeline of that night. They showed the GPS data placing Goldsby's ankle monitor at every crucial location. They presented the DNA evidence. They showed the cigarette butts from Reagan's car. They played Reagan's ATM transaction records. They presented testimony about the German Village robberies. The evidence was overwhelming. Goldsby's defense attorneys didn't dispute his involvement in Reagan's murder. Their strategy focused on the penalty phase. They argued that Goldsby's traumatic childhood had shaped his actions. They asked the jury for mercy, urging them to spare his life. The defense presented evidence of Goldsby's youth, the abuse he'd suffered, the lack of proper intervention, the failures of the juvenile justice system that had tried to address his behavior when he was young. But the prosecution countered with the brutality of Goldsby's crimes. They reminded jurors of the pregnant woman he'd terrorized in 2010. They talked about the German Village victims. They focused on Reagan, a young woman who had done nothing wrong, who had her whole life ahead of her, who begged for her life in a dark field and was executed anyway. On March 13th, 2018, what would have been Reagan's 23rd birthday, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all counts: aggravated murder, kidnapping, rape, aggravated robbery, tampering with evidence. Reagan's family wept after over a year of waiting, of reliving the horror, of sitting through testimony. They finally had accountability. But the trial wasn't over. Now came the penalty phase. Would Brian Goldsby receive the death penalty or life in prison without parole? The jury deliberated for 4 days during the penalty phase. The decision they faced was monumental. Literally life or death. In the end, they couldn't reach unanimity. 4 jurors voted for life in prison. 8 voted for death. Under Ohio law, a death penalty verdict requires a unanimous decision. On March 21, 2018, Judge Mark Surratt sentenced Brian Goldsby to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing, Judge Surratt addressed Goldsby directly. His words captured the terrible irony of the situation. Reagan did nothing wrong, whatsoever, and yet she forfeited her life because of your background. You get spared because of your background, and yet she forfeited her life. The judge also mentioned something chilling. If law enforcement hadn't done what they did, who knows if we would have had other victims. Reagan's mother, Lisa Tokes, read a victim impact statement. Her words were devastating. Regardless of the outcome of today's verdict, it doesn't bring our daughter back. It doesn't erase the night of terror that Reagan had to endure. It doesn't erase the graphic details and images that are forever burned into our minds. The terror and pain that she endured that night at the hands of evil, she deserved better. And our loss and pain will never get better. Goldsby was given the opportunity to speak before sentencing. He waived that right. He had nothing to say. Later, Goldsby pleaded guilty to the 6 armed robberies he'd committed before murdering Reagan. He received additional sentences for those crimes, all to be served concurrently with his life sentence. Brian Goldsby is currently incarcerated at the Ohio State Penitentiary in Youngstown. A supermax prison. He will die there. For most families, the conviction and sentencing would mark the end of their involvement with the criminal justice system. They would grieve privately and try to rebuild their shattered lives. But the Tokes family couldn't do that. They couldn't accept that Reagan's death had been inevitable, because it wasn't. It was preventable. Entirely preventable. Lisa, Toby, and Mackenzie Tokes began researching Ohio's parole system. What they discovered horrified them. The adult parole authority was overwhelmed. Parole officers carried caseloads that made meaningful supervision impossible. GPS monitoring existed, but the data wasn't being reviewed in real time. There were no automatic alerts when offenders violated their terms. Exclusion zones, areas where high-risk offenders shouldn't be allowed, weren't being implemented consistently. And Reagan wasn't the only victim. The Tokes family discovered other cases where parolees under state supervision had committed heinous crimes, while supposedly being monitored. They found the case of Rachel Anderson, who was killed by Anthony Pardon almost a year after Reagan's death. Pardon was supposed to be on a GPS ankle monitor, as part of an interstate compact program, but the system failed to implement it. The Tokes family realized that systemic change was needed. They couldn't bring Reagan back, but they could fight to prevent other families from experiencing their nightmare. They started the Reagan Tokes Memorial Foundation. They began meeting with lawmakers. They shared Reagan's story and the story of how the system had failed with anyone who would listen, and they began drafting legislation. In 2018, the Reagan-Tokes Act was introduced in the Ohio House and Senate. The legislation had multiple components, all designed to close the gaps that had allowed Goldsby to murder Reagan. The first part addressed sentencing reform. It created an indefinite sentencing structure for certain felonies, allowing the parole board to extend sentences based on an offender's conduct and rehabilitation progress. The goal was to ensure dangerous individuals weren't automatically released just because their minimum sentence was up. Governor John Kasich signed this portion of the Reagan-Tokes Act into law in December of 2018. It went into effect in March of 2019. But the Tokes family wasn't done. They knew the sentencing reform alone wasn't enough. They needed to fix the supervision and monitoring system. The second part of the Reagan-Tokes Act focused on GPS monitoring and parole officer caseloads. It proposed reducing the number of cases each parole officer handled so they could actually supervise their charges effectively. It required GPS data to be monitored in real time, with automatic alerts for violations. It mandated the creation of re-entry programs for offenders who couldn't be placed in halfway houses. This portion of the legislation faced more resistance. It required funding. It required systemic overhaul. It required the state to acknowledge failures and commit to change. The Tokes family refused to give up. Mackenzie, Reagan's younger sister, became a fierce advocate. She spoke at rallies. She testified before legislative committees. She kept Reagan's story in the public consciousness. With legislative work, we're still not done in Ohio, Mackenzie said at a Rally for Reagan event. And until we finish in Ohio, we're not going to move on to anything else. The legislation was reintroduced multiple times. In February 2022, House Bill 16-6, containing the monitoring and supervision reforms, finally passed the Ohio House, but it still needed to clear the Senate. Meanwhile, legal challenges to the sentencing portion of the Reagan-Tokes Act worked their way through the courts. Some defendants argued the law was unconstitutional, claiming it violated separation of powers by allowing a parole board rather than a judge to extend sentences. Different appellate courts reached different conclusions. The issue eventually reached the Ohio Supreme Court. In July of 2023, in a 5-2 decision, the Supreme Court upheld the Reagan-Tokes Act as constitutional. It was a victory, but for the Tokes family, it was bittersweet. No legal victory could bring Reagan back. The Tokes family also pursued legal action against the entities they believed were responsible for failing to protect Reagan. They sued the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, arguing the ODRC's negligence in monitoring Goldsby directly led to Reagan's death. They argued that the department knew Goldsby posed a substantial risk to public safety. They knew he had a violent history. They knew he'd committed dozens of infractions in prison. Yet they released him without adequate monitoring or supervision. The lawsuit argued that a special relationship existed between the ODRC and Goldsby, because they had the power to control him through his ankle monitor. They were literally tied to Goldsby's ankle. The lawsuit stated ODRC had the full mantle of control over Goldsby, with the ultimate power to arrest him or impose more restrictive terms of post-release control. The ODRC fought the lawsuit, and multiple courts dismissed it, citing governmental immunity. In August of 2019, the Ohio Supreme Court voted 6-1 not to hear the case. Justice Michael Donnelly was the lone dissenter. The Tokes family also sued Narration, Inc., the company that ran the housing program where Goldsby was staying. This lawsuit remained pending longer, but it too was eventually settled. The legal battles were frustrating. The Tokes family wasn't seeking money. They wanted accountability. They wanted acknowledgement that the system had failed. They wanted change. When the lawsuits were dismissed, they focused even more intently on legislative reform. If the courts wouldn't provide accountability, they would push for laws that prevented future tragedies. At Scioto Grove Metro Park, where Reagan's body was found, a memorial was created. Reagan's Garden is a place for reflection, for remembrance, for honoring a life that ended far too soon. The Tokes family also established a scholarship fund. They wanted to help other hard-working students achieve their college dreams, just as Reagan had been achieving hers. They wanted something positive to come from their tragedy. Reagan's story has been featured on numerous true crime programs. Dateline NBC's Unchecked Evil episode, on the case with Paula Zahn, Criminal Confessions on the Oxygen Network. The Columbus Dispatch listed her case as one of the region's top 10 news stories in 20. But for those who knew Reagan personally, she's more than a true crime story, more than a victim, more than a catalyst for legal reform. She was a daughter who called her dad every day, a sister who made Mackenzie laugh, a friend who was loyal and fun-loving, a student who was passionate about psychology and helping others, a young woman who loved Ohio State and considered it home. Her last tweet, posted before her death, showed a young adult excited about her future, about a career helping people. She had plans, she had dreams. We will always remember Reagan as a vibrant, loving young woman who embraced life. Her uncle Jeff McCrary said in a statement, "She made a positive impact on people, was enthusiastic about everything, and brought laughter and joy to all who knew her." That's who Reagan was. That's who she should be remembered as. Not just as a victim, but as a full person whose life mattered, whose dreams mattered, whose future mattered. Reagan Tokes' murder forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our criminal justice system. How do we balance rehabilitation with public safety when someone has proven themselves to be violent, predatory, and unwilling to follow rules even in a controlled prison environment? At what point do we acknowledge they may never be safe to release? Brian Goldsby's juvenile record showed sexual violence against children. His adult record showed he kidnapped and sexually assaulted a pregnant woman in front of her toddler. In prison, he committed 52 infractions. He fought, he defied authority. He showed no signs of rehabilitation. Yet the system determined he'd served his time. He was released, and the monitoring that was supposed to keep the public safe was perfunctory at best, non-existent at worst. The parole officers weren't malicious. They were overwhelmed. The system was underfunded and understaffed. Caseloads were unmanageable. Real-time GPS monitoring requires resources. People watching screens, algorithms flagging unusual patterns, quick responses to violations. None of that was in place. And even when Goldsby violated his terms, going AWOL, failing to charge his monitor, the response was to schedule a hearing for some time in the future. Not immediate action, not detention, just a hearing. Eventually, the halfway houses that refused to accept a Goldsby because of his violent history made the right decision for their residents and staff. But what happened instead? He was released homeless with minimal supervision. That's not a solution. That's passing the problem to the public. Reagan Tokes was in the wrong place, at the wrong time. But that phrase doesn't really capture the truth. She was exactly where she should have been, walking to her car after work, living her life, being a responsible young adult. Ryan Goldsby was in the wrong place. He shouldn't have been free to prowl the streets of Columbus. He shouldn't have had the opportunity to commit 6 robberies. He shouldn't have had the chance to kidnap, rape, and murder Reagan. The system that was supposed to prevent that failed. Completely. It's been over 7 years now since Reagan Tokes was murdered in that cold field in Scioto Grove Metro Park. Her killer will spend the rest of his life in prison. He will never hurt anyone again. But Reagan is still gone. Lisa and Toby Tokes still wake up every day without their daughter. Mackenzie still lives without her sister. Reagan's friends still feel the absence of her laughter, her enthusiasm, her joy. The Reagan Tokes Act has changed Ohio's criminal justice system in meaningful ways. Sentences can be extended for dangerous offenders who show they're not rehabilitated. GPS monitoring has improved. Parole officer caseloads are beginning to be addressed. But the work isn't done. The Tokes family knows that. They continue to advocate, to push, to fight for reforms, because Reagan deserved better. She deserved to graduate from Ohio State. She deserved to start her career in psychology. She deserved to help people the way she'd always dreamed of doing. She deserved to fall in love, to travel, to experience all the moments of life that were stolen from her. She deserved to live. And when a system fails as catastrophically as it failed Reagan, the only appropriate response is to ensure it never happens again. Not to another Reagan. Not to anyone. That's the legacy the Tokes family is building from their tragedy. That's how they're honoring their daughter and sister. Reagan Tokes was vibrant. She was loving. She embraced life fully. She made people laugh. She cared about helping others. That's who she was. That's who she should have been allowed to become. Rest in peace, Reagan. Your family made sure your death wasn't meaningless. Your name is now synonymous with reform, with change, with protection for future victims. And that's not nothing. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we travel to the heart of Minnesota, to a place where neighbors know each other by name, where church bells mark the rhythm of life, and where doors are often left unlocked. It's the kind of place where parents feel safe, where children ride their bikes on sidewalks until the streetlights flicker on, and where tragedy feels impossible. This is the story of Watkins, Minnesota, a town of fewer than 1,000 souls, and of a night in August 2016 that would shatter its sense of safety forever. It's the story of 5-year-old Alina Ertl, a girl who loved the movie Frozen, who wore her favorite pink and purple skirts, and whose smile could light up a room. And it's the story of how someone the family trusted, someone they welcomed into their home, would commit an act so unthinkable that it would leave an entire community asking the same question, why? To understand this story, you need to understand Watkins. Picture a town where everyone waves as they pass, where the biggest landmark is St. Anthony Catholic Church, and where Friday night softball games bring the community together. It's the kind of place where you don't need to lock your doors, where your neighbor is your friend, and where your friends become family. In the summer of 2016, Watkins was still recovering from another disaster. A tornado had torn through earlier that year, ripping apart a care facility and displacing dozens of residents. The community had rallied together, as small towns do, helping each other rebuild. They were resilient, they were strong, they believed nothing truly terrible could happen there. On Meeker Street, in a modest tan-sided house just a stone's throw from the church, lived the Ertl family. Matt and Kayla Ertl were young parents with 2 children. Their son Carter and their daughter Elena Jen Ertl, who had just turned 5 years old that October. Elena was everything you'd imagine a 5-year-old girl to be. She was giggly, sometimes silly, with sandy blonde hair that her mother kept neatly trimmed. She loved jewelry and skirts, but she was just as happy playing with her older brother on the go-karts their father built. She followed her cousins around, adoring them, wanting to be just like them. Her family called her Lainey. She was shy at first, but once you got to know her, she was full of life and laughter. She never seemed unhappy. Her favorite movie was Frozen. She knew all the songs by heart, and her favorite colors were pink and purple, the same colors that would later fill the sky at a vigil held in her memory. Alina was about to start kindergarten at Eden Valley Watkins Elementary School. Her teachers already knew her. Her mother, Kayla, worked and volunteered there. They were excited to have Lainey in their class. They couldn't wait to see her smile every morning. Matt Ertel worked as a utility locator for a company called Vanguard Utility Partners. It was honest work driving around, finding and marking underground utility lines before construction crews broke ground. He worked alongside a younger man named Zachary Todd Anderson. Zachary was born on November 26, 1990, making him 25 years old in the summer of 2016. He lived in Coon Rapids, a suburb north of the Twin Cities, but he had grown up in Monticello, not far from Watkins. By most accounts, Anderson seemed like a regular guy. Quiet maybe, but friendly enough. He and Matt became more than just coworkers. They became friends. Every Friday during the summer, there was a softball game in Watkins. Matt played and Anderson joined the team. After games, they'd go to Gordy's bar on Central Avenue with the other guys, have a few drinks, talk, laugh. Anderson became a familiar face in town. He started spending the night at the Ertel house regularly, on the couch in the guest space, wherever there was room. He was part of the group. He was trusted, but there were things about Zachary Anderson that no one in Watkins knew. 10 years earlier, when Anderson was just 15 years old, something had happened. According to court documents that would later be unsealed, a neighbor in Monticello reported that young Zachary had been leaving love notes on her car. Notes that commented on her appearance, and included his phone number. She was an adult woman. He was a teenager. She ignored them, but the notes didn't stop. In December of 2006, Anderson showed up at her door. He demanded she have sex with him. When she refused repeatedly, he finally left when her boyfriend came to the door. Then, in June 2007, Anderson broke into her home by removing a window screen. He stole her cell phone. He was caught, charged with first-degree burglary and theft, and eventually pleaded guilty to third-degree burglary. He was sentenced to mandatory community service. It was a juvenile offense. The records were sealed. When Anderson became an adult, his record was clean. No one looking at him would know about the break-in, the stolen phone, the troubling behavior. To the Ertel family, to the people of Watkins, Zachary Anderson was just Matt's friend, someone they could trust. Friday, August 19, 2016, was like any other Friday in Watkins that summer. The heat of the day gave way to a pleasant evening. Matt Ertel and Zachary Anderson played softball together. After the game, they went out with friends, probably to Gordy's, sharing drinks and stories, unwinding after a long week of work. It was late when they returned to the Ertel house. Well after midnight, Matt and Zachary stayed up talking, just two friends sitting in the living room, maybe watching TV, maybe just shooting the breeze. The hours slipped by. At some point around 2 a.m., Kayla Ertel tucked Elena into bed. The little girl was tired, her blonde hair spread across the pillow, her small body curled under the covers. Her pink Disney blanket, the one with her favorite characters, was pulled up to her chin. Matt and Zachary kept talking. The clock crept toward 4 a.m. Finally exhausted, Matt said goodnight and went to bed. Zachary stayed up. The house was quiet now, save for the sounds of sleep, the soft breathing, the creaks of an old house settling. And somewhere in those dark, silent hours, something shifted. Something terrible began. At 8 a.m. on Saturday, August 20, Kayla Ertel woke up. The house felt wrong. It was too quiet. She checked the kids' rooms. Carter was there, still asleep, but Alina's bed was empty. The pink blanket was gone. Panic set in quickly. Kayla called for Matt. They searched the house, the bathroom, the closets, the basement. Nothing. Then they noticed something else. Zachary Anderson was gone, and so was Matt's white 202 GMC Sierra pickup truck. Matt's cell phone was still in the truck. At first, maybe there was confusion. Maybe Anderson had taken Elena somewhere to get breakfast, to the park. But that didn't make sense. Not at 8 a.m. Not without telling them. And not with their truck. By 10 a.m., the Urchels filed a missing persons report with the Meeker County Sheriff's Office. Deputies immediately began canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen a little girl, a man, a white pickup. They contacted the family's cell phone provider, trying to trace the location of Matt's phone. They checked surveillance footage from local businesses. Nothing, no leads, no sightings. At 1:12 p.m., the decision was made. An Amber Alert was issued across the state of Minnesota. The message was clear and urgent. 5-year-old Alina Jean Ertel was missing. She was last seen wearing pajamas. The suspect was identified as 25-year-old Zachary Todd Anderson, and he was driving a white GMC Sierra. The alert included a description of the truck and Anderson. The entire state mobilized. Law enforcement agencies coordinated. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension joined the search. Tips started pouring in. Every minute counted. Everyone hoped they'd find Elena safe. Everyone prayed this would end well. The search was frantic, methodical and desperate all at once. Meeker County deputies worked alongside state troopers and BCA agents. Following every lead, chasing every shadow, they traced Matt's cell phone, the one still in the truck, determined it had briefly pinged in Todd County about 60 miles northwest of Watkins, around 6:30 that morning, but after that, the trail went cold. Meanwhile, in Watkins, the community rallied. Neighbors gathered at the Urch house, bringing food, offering comfort, praying together. The town was in shock. How could this happen? How could a family friend, someone they all knew, do something like this? At 2 p.m., a critical tip came in. Anderson's father called the Cass County Sheriff's Office. He'd seen the Amber Alert. He recognized his son's name. He told deputies that Zachary had called him earlier that morning, asking for permission to use the family's cabin. The cabin was located near Motley in Cass County, a remote area in north-central Minnesota, about 80 miles north of Watkins. It was part of a place called Wilderness Park Estates, a collection of small cabins and trailer homes nestled among tall trees and accessible only by gravel roads. Anderson's father gave authorities permission to search the property. 2 teams of officers responded. One team went to the cabin itself, located at 4926 Iroquois Trail Loop southwest. The other team, accompanied by a K-9 unit, searched the surrounding area. When the first team arrived at the cabin, they found Matt's white GMC Sierra. It was hidden in a ravine at the southwest end of the property. Concealed from view, no one was inside. The officers approached the cabin and broke in. Inside, they found something chilling: a 20-gauge shotgun, ammunition, and a handwritten suicide note. But no Elena, no Anderson. The second team, led by Cass County Deputy Bill Connor and his K-9 partner, Yankee. A German Shepherd trained in tracking followed footprints from the cabin into the woods. The terrain was difficult: dense trees, thick brush, swampy ground. They pushed deeper into the wilderness, guided by Yankee's nose. Then, at 4:24 p.m., they found him. Zachary Anderson was standing knee-deep in a swamp, his clothes soaked, his left wrist cut and bleeding. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't try to run. He didn't resist arrest. When officers approached, he simply stood there, silent and still, as if he'd been waiting for them. "Where is the girl?" they asked. Anderson's first response was chilling. "What girl?" he said. But he knew. Of course he knew. Later, when investigators from the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension questioned him again, Anderson's resolve broke. He told them Elena was hidden in the swamp, under brush and debris. He pointed in a general direction. "Over there," he said. Officers pushed through the murky water, their boots sinking into the mud. An investigator spotted something pink first. Elena's Disney blanket, the one she'd been sleeping with just hours earlier. And then beneath the surface of the water, hidden by branches and debris, they found her. Elena Ertel's small, naked body was completely submerged. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The Ramsey County Medical Examiner's Office performed an autopsy on Elena's body. The preliminary findings were released the next day, Sunday, August 20. The official cause of death was listed as homicidal violence, a term used when the death is clearly a murder, but the specifics are still being investigated. As the autopsy continued, more details emerged. Alina had been strangled. There was evidence of blunt force trauma to her head, and there was evidence of sexual assault. The little girl who loved Frozen, who wore pink and purple, who was about to start kindergarten, had been kidnapped, assaulted, and murdered by someone her family trusted. Someone who had slept in their home. Someone who had played on their softball team. Someone who had been their friend. On Tuesday, August 23, 2016, Zachary Todd Anderson appeared in Cass County District Court in Walker, Minnesota. He was charged with multiple felonies: second-degree murder, first-degree criminal sexual conduct with a person under the age of 13, 2 counts of kidnapping, and theft of a motor vehicle. Anderson stood in the courtroom wearing an orange jail-issued jumpsuit, his hands and legs in shackles. He showed no emotion. His bail was set at $2 million without conditions, or $1 million with court-imposed conditions. He requested a public defender. In October 2016, a grand jury indicted Anderson on 19 criminal counts. These included 8 counts of first-degree murder, second-degree intentional murder, 4 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of first-degree criminal sexual conduct, interference with a dead body, and motor vehicle theft. Anderson pleaded not guilty to all charges. For the next year and a half, the case wound its way through the legal system. Anderson's defense attorney, Scott Collins, filed multiple motions. He argued that Anderson's constitutional rights had been violated, that investigators had improperly questioned him after he invoked his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. He asked the judge to suppress key pieces of evidence, including Anderson's initial statements and the details of how Elena's body was discovered. In May 2017, Judge Jan Osted ruled on one of those motions. She agreed with the defense on a narrow point. Anderson's first statement to investigators, made shortly after his arrest, was inadmissible because he had not been properly advised of his rights. However, the judge allowed most other evidence to stand, including Anderson's later statements and the physical evidence found at the scene. The defense also asked to have the trial moved out of Cass County, arguing that Anderson couldn't receive a fair trial there because of the extensive media coverage and community outrage. That motion was denied. A trial was scheduled for April 2018. Cass County Attorney Benjamin Lindstrom was prepared to argue for the maximum sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The prosecution had a strong case: physical evidence, Anderson's own admissions, and forensic findings. But a trial would mean weeks of testimony, graphic descriptions of the crime, and reliving the horror for Elena's family. Then on March 2, 2018, something unexpected happened. On what was supposed to be a routine pre-trial hearing, Zachary Todd Anderson's attorneys signaled that their client was ready to change his plea. Anderson appeared before Judge Gina Osted, and in a courtroom filled with Elena's family members, law enforcement officers, and members of the community, he pleaded guilty. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of first-degree murder while committing criminal sexual conduct, the most serious charge. In exchange, the other 18 counts would be dismissed. Under Minnesota law, the mandatory sentence for first-degree murder involving sexual conduct is life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no plea deal, no bargaining. Anderson would receive the maximum sentence regardless. Prosecutor Lindstrom later said he was surprised Anderson took the plea. There was no incentive to do so, he explained. If the case went to a jury trial, the result would have been the same. But perhaps Anderson couldn't face a trial. Perhaps he knew what the evidence would show. Perhaps in some small way he wanted to spare the Ertel family from having to sit through weeks of graphic testimony. As part of the plea, Anderson was required to answer questions in court about the crime. Under Minnesota Rule 15, a judge cannot accept a guilty plea without ensuring the defendant understands what they're admitting to. So, in a quiet courtroom, Anderson described what he had done. He admitted to kidnapping Elena from her home in Watkins. He admitted to sexually assaulting her. He admitted to killing her and leaving her body in the swamp in Cass County. Family members in the courtroom became emotional. Some cried. Some looked away. Elena's parents, Matt and Kayla, sat together, their faces a mixture of grief and disbelief. Several family members read victim impact statements, describing their loss, their pain, the hole left in their lives by Elena's death. And then, immediately after accepting the plea, Judge Osted sentenced Zachary Todd Anderson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was over. At least the legal part was over. In the days and weeks following Elena's death, the community of Watkins came together in a way that only small towns can. On August 21, 2016, just one day after Elena's body was found, a GoFundMe page was launched to help the Ertel family with memorial expenses. The goal was set at $10,000. Within 8 hours, more than $14,000 had been raised. By August 23, it had exceeded $40,000. People brought flowers, balloons, stuffed animals, and angel figurines to their Ertel home on Meeker Street. The sidewalk and front yard became a memorial, a sea of pink and purple, Elena's favorite colors. On the evening of August 23, a candlelight vigil was held at St. Anthony Catholic Church. Hundreds of people attended, maybe even 1,000. They stood in the church parking lot, holding candles, singing hymns and praying together. At the beginning of the service, they released pink and purple balloons into the sky. As the balloons floated upward, the song Let It Go from Frozen played over the speakers. Children cried. Parents held them close. Strangers embraced. Father Aaronette, a priest at the church, spoke about Elena. She had a love for others which was free and innocent, he said. Don Kilk Dukel, a kindergarten teacher who was supposed to have Elena in her class that fall, stood in the crowd. Horrific. Very difficult, she said. Just not knowing, not understanding why, and trying to understand just where we go from here. Elena's funeral was held on Friday, August 26, at St. Anthony Church. She was buried there, in the town she loved, surrounded by the people who loved her. In the years since Elena's death, her family has worked to keep her memory alive. On Halloween 2016, just 2 months after she was killed, Kayla Ertel hosted a public event that doubled as a celebration of Elena's birthday. Elena had been born on October 31, and she loved Halloween. The event became an annual tradition. From that first Halloween party, a charity was born, sharing Elena Ertel's love. The charity collects donations, toys, money, supplies, and distributes them throughout the year to sick children and families in need. They've donated to St. Cloud Hospital to families who've experienced loss, to anyone who needs a little bit of light in the darkness. Elena's family wanted to turn their grief into something good. They wanted to make sure that even in death, Lenie's love would continue to spread. On September 10, 2023, a life-size statue of Elena was unveiled in McCarthy Park in Watkins. It was the result of a 2-year collaboration between local businesses, community members, and Elena's family. The statue shows Elena as she was in life. Smiling, joyful, free. It's a place where people can go to remember her, to honor her, to reflect on the fragility of life, and the importance of protecting the innocent. Even now, years later, there are questions that will never be fully answered. Why did Zachary Anderson do this? What drove him to commit such a heinous act against a child who trusted him, whose family trusted him? Meeker County Sheriff Brian Cruz said it best in the hours after Elena's body was found. We have no known motive. We are at a loss as to why this happened. Anderson's background offered few clues. Yes, there was the incident when he was 15. The love notes, the break-in, the troubling behavior, but that was a decade earlier. As an adult, he had no criminal record. He held down a job. He had friends. He seemed by all outward appearances to be a normal person. But something dark lived inside him. Something that he kept hidden, locked away, until that night in August when it broke free. Nicole Rohrbeck, a cousin of the Ertel family, perhaps summed it up best. A freak of nature, we can handle, she said. This makes you sick. That's the truth, isn't it? We can understand natural disasters. We can comprehend accidents, illnesses, even random violence. But when someone we trust, someone we invite into our homes, someone we consider a friend, commits an act of such pure evil, that's something our minds struggle to process. That's something that shakes us to our core. Elena Jan Ertel was 5 years old when she died. She loved Frozen. She loved pink and purple. She loved her brother, her parents, her cousins. She was about to start kindergarten. She had her whole life ahead of her. And on a quiet August night in a small town where everyone knew each other, where doors were left unlocked and neighbors were friends, all of that was taken away by someone who should have protected her. Zachary Todd Anderson is now serving a life sentence in a Minnesota state prison. He will never be released. He will spend every day for the rest of his life behind bars, knowing what he did, carrying the weight of his crime. But for the Erdo family, for the community of Watkins, the sentence doesn't bring Elena back. It doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't answer the question that haunts them every day, why. All they can do now is remember her, celebrate her, share her love with the world. And perhaps, in doing so, they can find a small measure of peace. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. There's something peaceful about the early morning hours, before the world wakes up. That quiet time when darkness still hangs in the air, when the streets are empty and everything feels still. For some people, those hours belong to them alone. They're sacred, a time for reflection, for exercise, for finding that space where the mind can breathe. Eliza Fletcher knew those hours well. She had claimed them for herself, made them part of her routine. Every morning before the sun rose over Memphis, Tennessee, she would lace up her running shoes and head out into the darkness. It wasn't reckless. It was her ritual, a discipline that had seen her qualify for the Boston Marathon. Those early morning miles were hers. But on September 2nd, 2022, those sacred hours would be violated in the most violent way possible. And a community would be left asking a question that has no good answer. Why? Let me tell you about Eliza first. Not the victim, not the headline, the person. She was born Eliza Welford in 1987. Into a prominent Memphis family. Her grandfather, Joseph Orgil III, had built a fortune in the hardware business with Orgil Inc., one of the largest independent hardware distributors in the world. The kind of wealth that could have made her life easy, insulated, protected. But Eliza didn't choose that path. She chose to teach after graduating from Hutchison School in Memphis, where she excelled as both a soccer player and pentathlete. She went on to study exercise and sports science at Baylor University. She played soccer there too. Athletic, driven, the kind of person who pushed herself. Later, she earned a master's degree in teaching from Belmont University in Nashville, specializing in elementary education. By 2022, she was teaching junior kindergarten at St. Mary's Episcopal School in Memphis. Her students loved her. Their parents loved her. There's a video that her family later released, showing her interacting with young children during the pandemic. Her smile is radiant, genuine. She had that rare quality that made children feel safe and seen. She is a caring and passionate teacher who is always looking for creative ways to teach to all learners. The school wrote about her in 2021. Her smile brightens every room she enters. In 2014, Eliza married Richard Fletcher III, known as Richie. They met at Second Presbyterian Church in Memphis. Their wedding was featured in Memphis Magazine, a lavish affair at the Dixon Gallery and Gardens. Together they had 2 young sons. They lived in the Central Gardens neighborhood of Memphis, in a beautiful home filled with the warmth that comes from a family that loves each other. Eliza was 34 years old in September of 2022. She was an avid runner who had qualified for the Boston Marathon. She ran 8.2 miles almost every morning, starting around 4 a.m. That was her time, those dark, quiet hours before the world woke up, before her students arrived, before her sons needed her. That was when Eliza Fletcher belonged only to herself. On her Facebook page, she had once asked friends for recommendations for good true crime podcasts to listen to while running. She enjoyed Serial, Up and Vanished, Dr. Death. In December 2020, she posted, "Hey friends, I'm looking for good true crime podcast. Drop your favorite." The terrible irony of that post would haunt everyone who read it later. The sun hadn't yet risen over Memphis when Eliza Fletcher stepped out of her house that Friday morning. It was approximately 4:00 a.m. The air was warm, typical for early September in Tennessee. She was wearing a pink jogging top and purple Lululemon running shorts. She had her phone with her in a water bottle. Her route took her near the University of Memphis campus, an area she knew well. She had run this path countless times. The streets were empty, just the way she liked them, her breathing steady, her pace strong. This was her 8th mile, just a little over a mile left to go, but she wasn't alone. Surveillance cameras would later reveal what happened next, and it's difficult to describe without feeling the horror of it. A black GMC Terrain SUV had been parked in the area since approximately 3:46 a.m., near 308076 Central Avenue. For 24 minutes, someone had been waiting in that vehicle. Watch it. At approximately 4:20 a.m., the SUV's lights came on. It began to move, slowly at first, passing Eliza as she ran. Then it stopped, waited. The driver knew she was coming back this way. When Eliza jogged past the vehicle, a man got out. He moved quickly, aggressively. He ran toward her. There was a brief struggle. Brief but violent. And then he forced her into the passenger seat of the SUV. First, the vehicle remained parked there for 4 minutes. 4 long minutes. What happened in those 4 minutes, we can only imagine, though we may not want to. And then the SUV drove away, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. Eliza Fletcher was gone. A short time later, around 7:00 a.m., cyclist riding on Central Avenue near Zach H. Curlin Street noticed something odd. A cell phone lying in the street, and nearby, a pair of Champion slide sandals, just sitting there, abandoned. The cyclist knew something wasn't right. He picked up the items and eventually gave them to a member of Eliza's family, who turned them over to the police. At 7:45 a.m., 2 calls came into the Memphis Police Department. One from Richie Fletcher reporting that his wife hadn't returned from her morning run. One from the University of Memphis. Both calls were about the same person, Eliza Fletcher. The Memphis Police Department immediately began investigating. They reviewed surveillance footage from the area. They found the video showing the abduction. They saw the GMC Terrain. They saw the violent struggle, and they knew, with sinking certainty, that this was bad. Very bad. By that afternoon, the story had broken across Memphis. A beloved kindergarten teacher, a mother of 2 young boys, had been kidnapped while jogging. The Fletcher family offered a $50,000 reward for any information leading to Eliza's safe return. The community rallied. Volunteers began searching. Social media exploded with posts pleading for her safe return. But the police were already following another lead. Those Champion slide sandals found at the scene. They'd been sent to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation for DNA testing, and the results came back quickly. There was DNA on those sandals, and it matched someone in the CODIS database, the FBI's combined DNA index system that stores DNA profiles from convicted offenders. His name was Cleotha Abston. Cleotha Abston, also known by the street name Pookie, 38 years old, and not someone Memphis police were unfamiliar with. Let me take you back to May 25th, 2000, 22 years earlier, Beale Street in Memphis. Around 2:00 a.m., a criminal defense attorney named Kemper Durand was leaving a party walking to his car when a gunman appeared behind him. The gunman was 16 years old. His name was Cleotha Abston. Abston took Durand's wallet, then forced him into the trunk of his own car at gunpoint. For several hours, Durand remained in that trunk while Abston drove around, picking up friends. Eventually, Abston took Durand out and forced him to drive to a Mapco gas station to withdraw money from an ATM. But fate intervened. A uniformed Memphis Housing Authority guard happened to walk into that gas station at just the right moment. Durand yelled for help. The kidnappers ran. Abston was caught and arrested. In a victim impact statement written for the court, Durand described his terror. "I was extremely lucky that I was able to escape from the custody of Cleotha Abston. It is quite likely that I would have been killed had I not escaped." During noted that Abston showed absolutely no remorse for the crime. He detailed how it took Abston 15 months to finally plead guilty, refusing to sign for any time in what Durand called jailhouse braggadocio. Abston pleaded guilty in 2001 to especially aggravated kidnapping and aggravated robbery. He was sentenced to 24 years in prison. He would serve 20 of those years, being released in November 2020 with credits for jail time and participation in prison work programs. But Abstin's criminal history went back even further than that. Court records reviewed by investigators revealed a deeply disturbing pattern. His first arrest came in 1995, when he was just 11 years old, for theft. From there, it escalated. Between 1995 and 2000, he was detained 16 times. The charges included aggravated assaults, rape, unlawful possession of a weapon, burglary, and more. Juvenile court records indicated that Abstin was part of the LMG gang, Lemoyne Gardens Gangstas. His father was incarcerated when he was first arrested. Court documents noted that while he claimed to have a good relationship with his family, his childhood was rough. He dropped out of school after 9th grade. In assessment documents, he was described as 100% violent. One particularly chilling detail: in his juvenile records, Abstin was convicted of rape. The victim was male. The conviction was sustained and Abstin was placed in the custody of Shelby County's Youth Services Bureau. When he was released from prison in November 2020, after serving 20 years for kidnapping Kemper Duran, Cleotha Abstin walked back into Memphis as a free man. But he was the same person he'd always been. Violence wasn't something he'd left behind in prison. It was who he was. In September 2021, exactly 1 year before Eliza Fletcher's abduction, Abstin raped and kidnapped a woman named Alicia Franklin at gunpoint. But due to delays in processing the sexual assault kit, delays that would later spark legislative reform in Tennessee, he wasn't charged in that case until after he was arrested for Eliza's murder. He would eventually be convicted in April 2024 and sentenced to 80 years in prison for that crime. On September 1st, 2022, the day before Eliza Fletcher's abduction, Abstin committed another crime. A woman who worked at a cleaning service reported that her wallet had been stolen from her workplace. Surveillance footage showed Abstin taking it while he was working there. He used her debit cards to make several purchases, spending a total of $901. He would later be charged with identity theft, theft of property, and fraudulent use of a debit card. This was who Cleotha Abstin was. In the hours before he encountered Eliza Fletcher, a man with an unbroken pattern of violence, spanning decades. A predator. On Saturday, September 3rd, U.S. Marshals arrested Cleotha Abstin. They'd found the GMC Terrain at an address where Abstin had been staying, the home of a woman named Gwendolyn Brown. The vehicle had a damaged passenger side taillight. When authorities arrived, Abstin saw them and ran. He was quickly captured. He was charged with especially aggravated kidnapping and tampering with evidence. But Eliza Fletcher was still missing. The Memphis Police Department, along with federal partners, launched a massive search. They focused on an area around the Longview Garden Apartments in South Memphis, searching residential areas and woods. Cell phone data was analyzed. Surveillance footage was reviewed frame by frame. Investigators found footage from a theater showing Abstin wearing what appeared to be the same Champion slide sandals found at the crime scene. Witnesses came forward with disturbing information. One witness said they saw Abstin at his brother's apartment around 7:50 a.m. On September 2nd, less than 4 hours after the abduction. He was cleaning the interior of the GMC Terrain with floor cleaner. It looked like he was behaving oddly, the witness told police. Abstin's brother also spoke to investigators. He said he saw Abstin washing his clothes in the sink of the house. He appeared to be acting very strange, the brother said. But still, no sign of Eliza. On Tuesday morning, September 6th, Abstin appeared before a judge for arraignment on the initial charges. He wore a green jail jumpsuit, a white undershirt, and a face mask. 5 members of Eliza's family sat in the courtroom, watching. Judge Louis J. Montesi Jr. asked them to refrain from any outburst or emotional reaction during the proceedings. Abstin spoke only to answer the judge's questions. He said he didn't have an attorney or funds to post bail. A public defender was appointed. His bail was set at $510,000. But that same day, the Memphis Police Department would make an announcement that would break the hearts of everyone who'd been holding on to hope. On Monday, September 5th at approximately 5:07 p.m., law enforcement officers were conducting a search in South Memphis near Victor Street. They were following leads generated by an FBI team analyzing cell phone data. The area they were searching was less than a mile from the apartment where Abston's brother lived, about 7.5 miles from where Eliza had been taken. Officers noticed vehicle tracks in the grass near the driveway of a vacant duplex, and they smelled something, an odor of decay. They walked to the back of the property. That's where they found her. Eliza Fletcher's body was lying on the ground behind the vacant building. She had been dead for days. Nearby, investigators found a trash bag containing purple running shorts that matched what she had been wearing. An autopsy would later reveal that Eliza died from a gunshot wound to the back of her head. She also had blunt force trauma injuries. Her face showed signs of trauma. Her jaw was fractured. Her right leg was injured. The toxicology report noted the presence of fentanyl in her system, though it couldn't determine how long it had been there or whether she had been sexually assaulted. The medical examiner's findings painted a picture of a violent, brutal death. Eliza Fletcher had fought. She had suffered, and then her life had been taken from her. When the identification was confirmed on Tuesday, September 6th, additional charges were filed against Clutha Abston: first-degree murder, premeditated murder, and murder in the perpetration of kidnapping. District Attorney Steve Mulroy announced that prosecutors would seek the death penalty. To lose someone so young and so vital is a tragedy in and of itself, Mulroy said at a press conference. But to have it happen in this way, with a senseless act of violence, it's unimaginable. The news spread through Memphis like a shockwave. The beloved kindergarten teacher, the devoted mother, the accomplished athlete, gone. Murdered. Her life stolen in the cruelest way imaginable. On Friday, September 9th, exactly 1 week after Eliza disappeared, more than 2,000 people gathered to honor her memory in a run dubbed Let's Finish Liza's Run. They ran her route, the full 8.2 miles she had been trying to complete that terrible morning. Over 3,000 more people expressed interest in participating. "I'm so impressed with the turnout. It's very emotional," one participant told reporters. The Memphis Police Department provided an increased presence in the area to support the event. People came from all over to pay their respects, to reclaim those streets, to say that women should be able to run safely at any time of day. The following day, on Saturday, September 10th, hundreds of mourners filled Second Presbyterian Church for Eliza's funeral, the same church where she and Richie had met, where they'd been married, where they'd built a life together. Her obituary described her as a born athlete and a strong believer in the importance of personal growth, who was not afraid to be vulnerable. Liza was a light to all who knew her, it read. Her contagious smile and laughter could brighten any room. Liza was pure of heart and innocent in ways that made her see the very best in everyone she met. At St. Mary's Episcopal School, where Eliza had taught, faculty and staff lit candles in her memory. Parents struggled to explain to their young children why their beloved teacher wouldn't be coming back. Counselors were brought in to help students process the grief. The case also reignited conversations about public safety in Memphis, about the delays in rape kit processing that had prevented Abston from being charged in the 2021 rape until after he'd killed Eliza. Tennessee legislators responded by passing a law requiring the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation to issue quarterly reports on sexual assault kit testing times. It was too late for Eliza, but perhaps it would help protect someone else. The tragedy also drew painful parallels for other families. Maggie Sutherland, whose daughter Sydney had been murdered while jogging in Arkansas in 2017, spoke about how Eliza's case triggered all those memories. It really hit. It's just like a trigger, and it sets you back and makes you replay things, she told reporters. For more than 2 years, the case wound through the legal system. Clutha Abston faced multiple trials. In April 2024, he was convicted in the 2021 rape and kidnapping of Alicia Franklin. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison for those crimes, but the murder of Eliza Fletcher remained unresolved. Prosecutors had announced they would seek the death penalty. A trial was scheduled for February 2020, and then on October 28, 2024, something unexpected happened. Clutha Abston, now 40 years old, appeared in Shelby County Court with his attorneys. After months of negotiations, he pleaded guilty. Guilty to first-degree murder. Guilty to especially aggravated kidnapping. Guilty to unlawful possession of a weapon in a separate case. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder. 40 years for the kidnapping. 8 years for the weapon charge. all sentences to run concurrently with his previous 80-year sentence for the Franklin rape. District Attorney Steve Mulroy read a statement from Eliza's family in court. It was directed at Abston. "We have no idea what happened to you, to turn you into someone so filled with a desire to hurt people. Whatever it was, it does not excuse or explain what you have done. You have changed our lives forever, and nothing will ever be the same. Your actions were evil. There is no other word for it. You murdered Liza, even though she did nothing to deserve it. She did not hurt you. In fact, she would have been the first to help if you needed it." The family later released their own statement. "We miss the bright light of Liza's life every day. Liza meant so much to so many, and her smile radiated happiness, energy, and comfort. Her husband, her children, her parents, her brother, the rest of her family, her friends, her students, her school families, her fellow teachers, her church community, and so many others were moved by countless examples of her faith, kindness, and compassion. No legal resolution and no sentence can diminish the anguish of Liza's murder." Mulroy emphasized the importance of ensuring public safety. "In terms of public safety, this dangerous person we know for sure will never be out on the streets again." Abston's attorney, Junie Ganguly, said they had been meeting with him regularly for months, telling him they couldn't succeed at trial. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage, DNA evidence, witness statements. There was no defense. "Now this guy can be forgotten, because he's going to prison to die," said Deputy District Attorney Paul Hagerman. And so we're left with questions that have no satisfying answers. Why did Cleotha Abston target Eliza Fletcher that morning? Was it random? Had he been watching her routine? Did he know who she was, the family she came from, or was she simply in the wrong place, at the wrong time? A woman running alone in the darkness, vulnerable to a predator who had been waiting. The investigators said they believed it was an isolated attack by a stranger. No connection between Eliza and Abston has ever been established. But that answer brings no comfort. If anything, it makes it worse. The randomness of it, the senselessness. We're left thinking about those early morning hours that Eliza had claimed for herself. That sacred time, that discipline, that space where she felt free. And we think about how that freedom was violated in the most violent way possible. We think about her two young sons, who will grow up without their mother. About Richie, who marked their anniversaries every year on Instagram with loving messages. Who called her his smoking hot babe. Who now has to navigate life without his partner. About her parents, Beasley and Adele Welford, who had to bury their daughter. About her brother, her extended family, her students, her colleagues, her church community. We think about all the mornings she'll never run, all the children she'll never teach, all the smiles she'll never share, all the memories that will never be made. Eliza Fletcher was 34 years old when she died. She had so much life ahead of her, so much love to give, so much light to share with the world. And Cleotha Abston took all of that away, because he could, because he chose to, because in his 40 years of life he had never learned to do anything but hurt people. There's a bitter irony in the fact that Eliza enjoyed listening to true crime podcasts while she ran. She was fascinated by these stories, these dark tales of human nature at its worst, and then she became one of those stories herself. The morning hours are different now in Memphis, especially for women who run. That sense of safety, that belief that you can claim those quiet hours for yourself, has been shattered. More people run in groups now, more carry protection, more look over their shoulders. The innocence is gone. But the community also came together in ways that demonstrated the best of humanity in response to the worst. 2,000 people running Eliza's route, hundreds gathering for her funeral, strangers weeping for a woman they never knew but whose story touched something deep inside them. Legislation passed to protect other women from the kinds of systemic failures that allowed Abston to remain free after raping Alicia Franklin. In the end, we remember Eliza Fletcher not as a victim, but as she lived. As a teacher who brightened every room she entered. As a mother who loved her sons. As a wife who built a beautiful life with her husband. As an athlete who pushed herself to be better. As a woman who saw the best in everyone she met. Her family asked that she be remembered that way. Not for how she died, but for how she lived. And maybe that's the most important thing we can take from this story as we drift off to sleep. That even in the face of unimaginable evil, even when the worst of humanity reveals itself, there is still goodness, still light, still love. Eliza Fletcher was that light, and though her life was taken far too soon, that light continues to shine in the memories of everyone who knew her. Rest well, Eliza. You are not forgotten. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. It was the evening of May 6th, 2013, in the quiet suburb of Ancaster, Ontario. The kind of place where neighbors wave to each other and children ride their bikes until the street lights come on. Tim Bosma was putting his 2-year-old daughter to bed, reading her favorite story one more time before tucking her in. He kissed her forehead gently, the way fathers do when they think they have all the time in the world. Downstairs, his wife Charlene was finishing up the dishes. They'd been married for 3 years, together for 4.5, and they were building the kind of life people dream about. A house they'd built themselves. A beautiful daughter, plans for a second child. They attended church regularly, had strong ties to their community, and Tim ran a small contracting business. Money was a bit tight. It always is when you're building something from nothing, so they decided to sell Tim's diesel pickup truck, a 2007 Dodge Ram. Nothing fancy, but it was worth about $24,000. And that money would help. Tim had listed the truck on Kijiji and Auto Trader a few days earlier. The responses had been slow, but that evening someone had finally shown real interest. They'd called and said they wanted to come see it. Tim checked his watch. It was getting late for a test drive after 9 o'clock. But he was eager to make the sale. When they come, should I go with them? Tim asked Charlene, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Charlene was having a cigarette in the garage with their basement tenant, Wayne DeBoer. She thought for a moment. Yes, you should, she replied. Because we want the truck to come back. It was a practical answer. A sensible answer. The kind of thing you say without thinking it will be the last conversation you'll ever have with someone you love. Just after 9:20, Charlene and Wayne heard footsteps on the gravel driveway. Heavy, deliberate steps coming up from the road. It struck them as odd. The visitors had parked on the street instead of pulling into the driveway. When the two men emerged from the darkness, one of them explained casually that a friend had dropped them off and gone to Tim Hortons. The taller man was striking, broad-shouldered, confident, wearing a bright orange shirt that seemed almost garish in the porch light. He was handsome in an easy way, the kind of person you'd instinctively trust. His name, though no one knew it yet, was Dylan Millard. He was 27 years old and the Aeroterian aviation fortune. The other man hung back in the shadows, shorter, stockier, wearing an oversized red hoodie pulled up over his head, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Wayne DeBoer would later describe him as sketchy. His name was Mark Smitch, and he was 25 years old with dreams of becoming a rapper. Tim came outside, all smiles and hospitality, ready to show off his truck. They did a quick walk around, kicking the tires, checking under the hood, the usual routine. Then they climbed in. Millard in the driver's seat, Tim in the passenger seat, and Smikes in the back. "I'll be right back," Tim called out to Charlene. She watched the truck's taillights disappear down the driveway and onto the dark country road. Wayne DeBoer, trying to cut the tension he felt, made a nervous joke. That might be the last time we see him. No one laughed. By 10:30, Charlene was worried. Tim had said he'd be right back, and right back had stretched into an hour. She called his cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. She texted him. No response. She called again, and again. Nothing. At 11:30, her worry turned to fear. She called the police. The Hamilton Police Service took the report seriously. But there wasn't much to go on. 2 men had come to look at a truck. Now the truck and Tim were gone. It could be anything. Maybe the truck broke down, maybe Tim's phone died, maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation that would reveal itself in the morning. But morning came, and Tim didn't. By May 7th, Tim Bosma was officially missing. The police began their investigation, but they kept certain details close to their chest, including the fact that two unidentified men had taken Tim on that test drive. Some people reading the initial reports wondered if Tim had simply left. Marital problems, perhaps. Depression, debt. But anyone who knew Tim and Charlene knew that was impossible. The Bosma family didn't wait for the police to solve this alone. Within hours, their house had transformed into a command center. Volunteers streamed through the door. Friends from church, neighbors, strangers who'd heard about the missing man. They organized search parties, printed thousands of flyers, set up a Facebook page that quickly gained thousands of followers. Tim Hortons and gas station gift cards piled up on the kitchen table for the searchers. Casseroles and lasagnas arrived by the dozen. Everyone wanted to help, but no one knew what to do. How do you find someone who simply vanished into the night? On May 9th, Charlene made the hardest decision of her life. She agreed to hold a press conference. Standing before the cameras, her voice shaky but fierce, with her mother and Tim's mother standing behind her like silent sentinels. She spoke directly to whoever had taken her husband. My name is Charlene Bosma, and Tim is my husband. He is my partner and my best friend. He is the love of my life and the father of my child. The last few days have been very difficult for myself and our families. This does not feel like real life. This only happens on TV and in movies. It does not happen in real life. Her voice cracked, but she pushed forward. It was just a truck. A stupid truck. You don't need him, but I do. Our daughter needs her daddy. His parents need their little boy back. We look forward to putting our arms around Tim again and telling him how much we love him. The plea was broadcast across Canada. Millions of people saw Charlene's anguish. Millions of people prayed that Tim would come home, but some people already knew he never would. While the public search intensified, police were following a different trail. They'd tracked Tim's cell phone records and discovered something interesting. The last call to Tim's phone had come from a prepaid burner phone, registered under the name Lucas Bate. Lucas Bate didn't exist, but the burner phone had made other calls. One was to a man named Igor Tumenenko in Toronto. When police contacted Tumenenko, he had an alarming story to tell. Two men had come to test drive his truck the day before Tim disappeared, May 5th. The test drive had made him deeply uncomfortable. Tumenenko had mentioned during the drive that he was familiar with diesel engines from his time in the Israeli army. One of the men, the shorter one sitting in the back, had asked what he'd done in the army. You don't want to know, Tumenenko had replied. The two men had exchanged a look that sent chills down his spine. Tumenenko gave police detailed descriptions. The tall man was confident and well-dressed, and he had a distinctive tattoo on his wrist. The word ambition inside a box. That tattoo would break the case wide open. On May 10th, police departments from Hamilton, Toronto, and Peel region were comparing notes. Someone mentioned that they knew of a young man who matched the description. Tall, carried a satchel bag, and yes, had an ambition tattoo on his wrist. His name was Dylan Millard. Dylan Millard. The name meant something in Toronto. His grandfather, Carl Millard, had founded Millard Air in 1963, building it into a successful cargo airline. His father, Wayne Millard, had inherited the business, and Dylan, an only child born to wealth and privilege, was next in line for the fortune. By age 14, Dylan had set a world record, the youngest person to fly both a helicopter and a fixed-wing plane solo on the same day. By age 27, when his father died in what was ruled a suicide, Dylan had inherited everything: multiple properties, luxury cars, the aviation business, and millions of dollars. He was handsome, charming, the kind of man who threw pool parties where women outnumbered men 2-1. He had everything anyone could want. So why would he need to steal a used pickup truck? On the evening of May 10th, 2013, Dylan Millard was sitting in his GMC Yukon at a stop sign on Cawthra Road in Mississauga when a police officer approached with his gun drawn. Millard looked at the officer and calmly raised his hands. "Are you Dylan Millard?" "Yes." He was arrested on charges of forcible confinement and theft over $5,000. He showed no emotion, no surprise. It was as if he'd been expecting this moment. The next day, May 11th, police executed a search warrant at the home of Millard's mother in Kleinburg. There in the driveway inside a trailer registered to Millard Air, they found Tim Bosma's truck. The interior had been gutted, partially burned, but forensic investigators found what they were looking for: blood. Lots of it. On the dashboard, in the cracks of the vinyl seats, on the ceiling above the driver's side, in the bed of the truck, on the undercarriage, on the muffler. Blood everywhere. There was also gunshot residue in a spent cartridge. Millard's fingerprints were found throughout the vehicle. On May 14, 2013, police made the announcement that everyone had been dreading. Tim Bosma was dead. His remains, burned beyond recognition, had been found in an animal incinerator on a farm owned by the Millard family near Ayr, Ontario. The incinerator, which Millard called the Eliminator, was a large livestock cremator he'd purchased months earlier. Tim's body had been reduced to bone fragments. Charlene would later say that her husband's remains were returned to her in a box no bigger than a shoebox. As investigators dug deeper into Millard's life, another name kept appearing: Mark Smitch. The two had met around 206, and initially their friendship had been lopsided. Mark worshipped Dell, but Dell hated him, friends later said. But by 2012, Smitch and his girlfriend had moved into the basement of the Millard family home, and the two young men had grown close. Very close. Millard had begun organizing what he called missions. Nighttime excursions where he and friends would steal things just for the thrill of it. Bobcat construction equipment, lawnmowers, even trees. These weren't crimes of necessity. Millard was a millionaire. He could have bought anything he wanted. But he didn't want to buy things. He wanted to take them. For a year before Tim Bosma's murder, Millard and Smitch had been planning to steal a truck. They talked about it constantly. Smitch's girlfriend, Marlena Meneses, later testified that she'd overheard them discussing the plan in the days before May 6th. She tried to discourage her boyfriend. "I said some things to try to change his mind," she told the court, "but he didn't listen to me." On May 22, 2013, after a week of police surveillance, Mark Smitch was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in Tim Bosma's death. But Tim Bosma wasn't Millard's first victim, or even his second. As police investigated, they uncovered a trail of bodies that stretched back years. In July 2012, a 23-year-old Toronto woman named Laura Babcock had disappeared. She was Millard's ex-girlfriend, though they'd continued a sexual relationship even after he started dating another woman, Christina Nudga. Text messages revealed that Nudga had been uncomfortable with Babcock's presence in their lives. In one message, she told Millard she wanted Babcock gone. Millard had assured her, "I will make her disappear." And he did. Police believed that Millard and Smitch had killed Laura Babcock and burned her body in the same incinerator they would later use for Tim Bosma. Her remains were never recovered. In letters Millard wrote to Ned Dock from jail, he'd claimed that Babcock had overdosed on cocaine in his basement. Then in the next letter wrote, "I was just brainstorming. Forget it." In December 2017, both Millard and Smitch were convicted of Laura Babcock's murder, but there was another victim, one that hit even closer to home. On November 29, 2012, 6 months before Tim Bosma's murder, Dylan Millard's father Wayne was found dead in his bed. He'd been shot through the left eye. Police ruled it a suicide within days, and Wayne's body was cremated before anyone could ask questions. But after Millard's arrest in the Bosma case, investigators took a second look at Wayne Millard's death. What they found was chilling. The relationship between father and son had been deteriorating. Wayne was an alcoholic who'd struggled with depression, but he'd also been growing increasingly concerned about his son's behavior. He'd talked about cutting Dylan out of his will. Employees at Millard Air later testified about tensions between the two. Cell phone records showed that Dylan's phone had been at his father's house around 1 a.m. on the night Wayne died, staying there until after 6 a.m. The gun found next to Wayne's body had been purchased illegally by Dylan months earlier. His DNA was on the grip. In September 2018, Justice Maureen Forrestal delivered her verdict in the Wayne Millard case. Her words were damning. "I am satisfied that Dylan Millard killed his father by shooting him in the left eye as he slept. I can find no theory consistent with innocence." Dylan Millard wept when he heard the verdict. He was now a convicted triple murderer. his father, his ex-girlfriend, a complete stranger he'd met through an online ad. The trial for Tim DeWolf's murder began in February 2016 and lasted 4.5 months. More than 90 witnesses testified. The evidence was overwhelming. Blood, DNA, fingerprints, phone records, surveillance footage, witness testimony. But the most dramatic moment came when Mark Smich took the stand and testified that it was Millard who had pulled the trigger. He claimed he'd been following in a separate vehicle and had only helped dispose of the body afterward. He said Millard had promised him $200, some marijuana, and a restored Cadillac for his help. Millard's defense lawyer suggested it was actually Smich who had accidentally shot Tim while trying to steal the truck, that Millard was just an accomplice who'd helped cover up his friend's crime. The Crown argued that both men were equally responsible, that they'd set out together with a plan to steal a truck and murder whoever owned it. The theft wasn't about money. Millard was wealthy. It wasn't about need. He owned multiple vehicles. It was about the thrill, the power, the dark satisfaction of taking not just a man's property but his life. Every day of the trial, Charlene Bosma sat in the front row of the courtroom, surrounded by family and friends who became known as the Bosma Army. Every single day, no matter how gruesome the testimony, she was there. She looked the accused men in the eyes. She heard every terrible detail of what had happened to her husband that night. Tim's mother, Mary, sometimes had to flee the courtroom, overwhelmed by grief. But Charlene stayed. She'd made a promise to Tim, and she was going to see it through. On June 17, 2016, after 5 days of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. For both Dylan Millard and Mark Smich. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. 3 years of anguish, 3 years of waiting, 3 years of grief. All of it culminated in that single word. Guilty. Outside the courthouse, Charlene stood before the cameras once more. Her voice was stronger now, but the pain was still there, etched into every word. For over 3 years, we have waited for justice for Tim. For 3 years, we have been in and out of this courthouse, forced to look at and breathe in the same space with the utter depths of depravity in our society. We have had to endure being near the 2 men that walked down my driveway on May 6, 2013, and took away the bright life in our lives that was Tim. She paused, composing herself. But this does not bring Tim back. He will still never come home. There is one absolute constant for us. Tim is gone. Both men received automatic life sentences with no possibility of parole for 25 years. When Millard was later convicted of killing Laura Babcock and his father, he received 2 more consecutive life sentences. Under the original sentencing, he wouldn't be eligible for parole until 2088, when he'd be 103 years old. However, a 2022 Supreme Court ruling changed Canadian law regarding consecutive life sentences, meaning Millard may become eligible for parole earlier. But given the nature of his crimes, few believe he will ever walk free. In the years since the verdict, Charlene Bosma has rebuilt her life with remarkable grace. She launched a charity called Tim's Tribute to help other families of homicide victims navigate the expensive and daunting court system. She's raised her daughter, who looks like Tim but has her mother's fierce spirit, with the support of her extended family and church community. She talks to Tim still, she's admitted. Not in a disturbed way, but in the way people do when they've lost someone too soon. She'll tell him about their daughter's accomplishments, about the little moments he's missing. On Father's Day, she takes their daughter to the cemetery, where the little girl dances and plays around her father's headstone, asking questions about heaven and when God will be done with Daddy. I choose to live well, Charlene has said. I choose to live happy. There's living, and there's living well. It's a remarkable statement from someone who's endured the unthinkable. The question that everyone asks, the question that haunts this case, is simple. Why would a millionaire heir, with everything to live for, throw it all away to steal a used truck? The Crown suggested it was about financial desperation. That Millard's wealth wasn't as secure as it appeared. That the aviation business was failing. But that doesn't fully explain it. Some believe it was about power and control. That Millard had spent his entire life being given everything he wanted. And at some point, taking things and eventually taking lives became the only thing that made him feel alive. The missions he organized weren't about the stolen lawnmowers or construction equipment. They were about the thrill of getting away with something. Others point to his relationship with his father. The weight of expectations. The crushing burden of inheriting a dynasty, the suffocating pressure to be someone he wasn't. When Wayne Millard began to pull back, to question his son's choices, to talk about cutting him out of the will, perhaps Dellon saw murder as the only way to claim what he believed was rightfully his. And then there's Mark Smitch, a young man from a troubled background who found in Millard a kind of twisted idol, a friend who could give him purpose, even if that purpose was evil. Mark cared for Dellon more than any other person. His girlfriend testified he was in love with him, but none of these explanations feel sufficient. Because ultimately what happened to Tim Bosma, Laura Babcock, and Wayne Millard wasn't about money or power or even thrill-seeking. It was about two men who discovered they enjoyed causing suffering, who found pleasure in the act of destruction, who reduced human lives to objects that could be taken and discarded. It's important in cases like this not to let the killers overshadow the victims. Tim Bosma was 32 years old when he died. He was a husband, a father, a son, a brother, a friend. He went to church every Sunday. He worked hard building his contracting business. He was building a home for his family with his own hands. He had a smile that lit up rooms, and a laugh that was generous and genuine. He was the kind of man who'd tuck his daughter into bed and read her one more story, even though he was tired from a long day of work. The kind of man who'd take strangers on a test drive at 9 o'clock at night because he wanted to make a sale to provide for his family. The kind of man who'd ask his wife if he should go because he wasn't quite sure, because something felt a little off, but who went anyway because he trusted in the basic goodness of people. Tim had everything to live for, the prosecutor said at trial, and his truck was not worth dying for. That night in May 2013, two men walked up a gravel driveway in Ancaster, Ontario, with murder in their hearts. They smiled at Charlene Bosma. They shook Tim's hand. They climbed into his truck, and they took him away forever. But they couldn't take his memory. They couldn't take the love his family still carries for him. They couldn't take the impact he had on every person who knew him. In that way, Tim Bosma won, because love, in the end, is stronger than evil. Memory is more powerful than destruction, and a life lived with kindness and integrity echoes longer than any act of violence ever could. Rest in peace, Tim Bosma. You are remembered, you are loved, and you will never be forgotten. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the small town of Stella, Missouri, where barely 200 souls call home, everyone knew the little girl on the purple bicycle. They'd see her pedaling down the quiet roads, her slender frame and brown hair catching the afternoon sun. She was 9 years old, always early to school, always eager for church on Wednesdays and Sundays. Her name was Rowan Damia Ford, and in November of 2007, she became the center of a tragedy that would haunt investigators for the rest of their careers. This is a story about trust betrayed, about darkness hiding in plain sight, and about a community that would never be the same. Tonight we'll walk through the events that led to Rowan's disappearance, the desperate search that followed, and the disturbing truth that eventually came to light. Rowan Ford was born on April 11, 1998, in San Diego, California. By 2007, she had made her way to the rural landscape of southwest Missouri with her mother, Colleen Munson. Life hadn't been easy for Colleen. She was a single mother working overnight shifts at Walmart to keep a roof over their heads. Eventually, she met and married David Wesley Spears, a 25-year-old local man who became Rowan's stepfather. They settled into a modest home in Stella, a tiny Newton County community where neighbors knew each other's business and children could ride their bikes without much concern. Rowan attended Triway Elementary School, where she was a fourth grader known for her dedication and sweet disposition. Her teacher, Todd Holt, would later remember her with profound clarity. He'd known her since second grade, and in a small school like Triway, teachers got to know their students well. She was a beautiful student, Holt recalled. She was an angel. She was perfect. I couldn't have asked for a better student. She knew when it was time to be 9 and to be silly, and when it was time to work. But there was something else about Rowan that people noticed in hindsight, though it seemed innocent at the time. She spent an unusual amount of time on that bicycle of hers, riding through town, keeping herself busy. She attended the after-school program 4 nights a week. She was often early to school and early to church. Looking back, some wondered if she was staying away from home more than a typical child would. The only concerns ever flagged to the Missouri Department of Social Services involved head lice, issues that the family had addressed. There were no red flags, no warnings, nothing to suggest what was coming. Rowan's bedroom was painted Barbie pink. She loved watching Hannah Montana, that Disney show about a girl leading a double life. She attended Stella Baptist Church, where she was active in Sunday school and Wednesday night teen kid programs. She kept a bookmark in her Bible with a verse from John 1:5. The light shines through the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. She had 2 older brothers, James and Robert, and 2 older sisters, Janice and Ariane. Ariane, who was 18 at the time, would later describe her youngest sister as a ray of sunshine. Rayan was the baby of the family, and she was deeply loved. During the summer and fall of 2007, a man named Christopher Leroy Collings came to live with the Spears family. He was 32 years old, a friend of David Spears from way back. Collings had been separated from his wife, who lived in Arkansas with their 3 children. He needed a place to stay, and David offered him the basement of their home. For several months, Collings was a fixture in the household. He slept downstairs, ate meals with the family, and even helped Rowan with her homework. The little girl called him Uncle Chris. She trusted him. He was part of the family, or so it seemed. Those who knew Collings described him as unremarkable. He didn't have much of a criminal record. Clinton Clark, the Wheaton chief of police, had known him for 17 years and never saw anything alarming. Collings appeared to be just another guy down on his luck, trying to get back on his feet. In late October 2007, Collings moved out of the Spears home. His family owned a farm in Wheaton, Missouri, about 20 minutes away in Berry County. He settled into a travel trailer on the property, a small space that would soon become the scene of unspeakable horror. Friday, November 2nd, 2007, started like many other evenings in the Spears household. Colleen was scheduled to work her overnight shift at Walmart. She would leave at 8:30 that evening, trusting her husband David to watch over Rowan. It was a routine they'd followed many times before. That evening, David Spears had plans with friends. He met up with Christopher Collings and another man named Nathan Mahurin at a farm where they'd been working. The 3 men decided to unwind after a long week. They drove to a liquor store and purchased 2 or 3 six-packs of malt liquor, then headed back to the Spears house to play pool and drink. Rowan was home, going about her evening routine. The men drank in the house, while Colleen prepared for work. At 8:30, she kissed her daughter goodbye and headed out the door, leaving Rowan in David's care. The girl eventually went to her pink bedroom and fell asleep on the floor, as children sometimes do. The 3 men continued drinking. They purchased more alcohol as the night wore on. At some point, they made a decision that would seal Rowan's fate. Collings asked Macarin to drive him back to his trailer in Wheat. He convinced David Spears to come along, even though it meant leaving 9-year-old Rowan home alone, asleep in her bedroom. What happened next would only be revealed through later confessions, and the details are chilling. According to what Collings would eventually tell police, he had a plan that night, as Mohorn drove David Spears home via back roads to avoid any police who might spot their intoxicated state. Collings got into his own vehicle and raced ahead. He knew the area well. He knew he could beat them back to the Spears house. He arrived first, while Rowan was still sleeping. He entered the home and went to her bedroom. He picked up the sleeping child and carried her out to his truck. Rowan, trusting Uncle Chris, didn't fight or scream. He drove her back to his trailer on the farm in Wheaton, the little girl still in her pajama. At Christopher Collings' trailer that night, something dark took hold. The man who had lived with Rowan's family, who had helped her with homework, who she'd trusted as Uncle Chris, committed an act of profound evil. Collings sexually assaulted the 9-year-old girl. The details preserved in court records and autopsy reports paint a picture of violence against a helpless child. But the horror didn't end there. According to Collings' confession, after the assault, he intended to take Rowan home. He was leading her outside, making sure she was facing away from him so she wouldn't see his face. He wasn't speaking, hoping she wouldn't recognize his voice. Perhaps he thought he could return her and somehow this nightmare would just go away. But then in the moonlight, Rowan turned and saw his face. She recognized him. Uncle Chris. The man she trusted. The man who had just hurt her in ways a child should never experience. Collins said he freaked out in that moment. The recognition in her eyes meant she could identify him. She could tell what he'd done. And so he made the decision to silence her forever. He found a coil of rope, the kind used in chicken houses, from an old pickup truck on the property. He looped it around Rowan's small neck and pulled. Court records indicate it would have taken approximately 30 seconds of sustained pressure to strangle her to death. 30 seconds of a child struggling, fighting for breath, not understanding why Uncle Chris was hurting her. When it was over, Rowan Damia Ford was dead. Collins had to dispose of her body. He drove to a remote area in McDonald County and found a cave, really more of a sinkhole. He placed Rowan's body inside and covered her with leaves and debris. Then he returned to his trailer and tried to erase the evidence. He burned the rope used in the attack. He burned the clothes he'd been wearing. He even burned his blood-stained mattress. Saturday morning, November 3rd, 2007. Colleen Munson finished her overnight shift at Walmart and drove home at 9 o'clock in the morning. She was tired, as anyone would be after working all night, but she was looking forward to seeing her daughter. When she arrived home, something felt wrong immediately. Rowan wasn't there. Colleen searched the house, looking in every room, calling her daughter's name. Nothing. She woke David and asked him where Rowan was. David's response was oddly casual. He told Colleen that Rowan was staying with a friend. But when Colleen pressed him for details, asking which friend, David couldn't provide a name. Colleen wanted to call the police right away. But David insisted Rowan was fine, that she was just at a friend's house and would be back soon. Hours passed. Colleen searched the neighborhood, walking the streets of Stella, asking neighbors if they'd seen her daughter. No one had. The little girl on the purple bicycle was nowhere to be found. As afternoon approached and there was still no sign of Rowan, Colleen's concern transformed into panic. She called 911 to report her daughter missing. Newton County Sheriff Chris Jennings took the call. Officers were immediately dispatched to help search for the 9-year-old girl. They combed through Stella, checking with friends, family, and neighbors. But there was no trace of Rowan Ford. Investigators quickly turned their attention to David Spears. He was the last person to see Rowan, and his behavior was raising red flags. He hadn't reported her missing for 8 to 10 hours after she disappeared, which seemed extremely strange. More concerning, his story kept changing. He was caught in several lies. Each time investigators questioned him, details shifted and contradicted earlier statements. Spears became a primary suspect, but he wasn't the only person of interest. Police also focused on Christopher Collins. The two men were close friends, and Collins had recently lived with the family. Officers needed to know where both men had been the night Rowan disappeared. On November 4th, the day after Rowan's disappearance, Newton County deputies approached Christopher Collins in the parking lot of a local restaurant. They asked him about his activities on the night of November 2nd. Collins told them he'd been with David Spears and Nathan Mahurin. They'd been drinking, playing pool at Spears' house. Later, he said Mahurin drove him home to his trailer in Wheaton, and Spears came along for the ride. After they dropped him off, Collins claimed he went to sleep and stayed there all night. He also told deputies he hadn't spoken to Spears since that night, and claimed he was unaware that Rowan was missing until police informed him. His story matched what Mahurin had told investigators, except Collins omitted the fact that they'd been smoking marijuana along with the drinking. The next day, November 5th, the FBI became involved in the case. The disappearance of a child is always treated with the utmost seriousness, but by this point, investigators feared the worst. Community members organized search parties, combing through fields, forests, and abandoned buildings. Hope was fading, but people kept looking. Meanwhile, Newton County deputies were seizing vehicles for examination. They took David Spears' pickup truck and a car that Spears' mother said she'd loaned him after the night Rowan disappeared. FBI technicians began processing these vehicles for evidence. Deputies approached Collins at his workplace and asked if he'd be willing to answer more questions. Collins agreed and drove himself to the sheriff's department. He gave a similar statement to what he'd said before. He also agreed to submit to a polygraph test and a computer voice stress analysis. both tools used to detect deception. Collings continued to deny any knowledge of Rowan's disappearance. He even offered to help with the search efforts. Later that same afternoon, Clinton Clark, the Wheaton chief of police, was on routine patrol when Collings flagged him down. Clark and Collings had known each other for 17 years. Collings told Clark that Rowan was missing and that he was trying to find her. It seemed like the concern of an innocent man wanting to help, but investigators weren't convinced. Both Spears and Collings were acting suspiciously, and their stories, while consistent with each other's, felt rehearsed. 6 days. For 6 agonizing days, Rowan's family and the community of Stella held on to hope. Amber Alerts had been issued. Her face was on television news broadcasts across Missouri and beyond. Volunteers searched tirelessly, believing that somehow, somewhere, Rowan was alive and waiting to be found. On November 9th, 2007, that hope was extinguished. A sheriff's deputy searching a rural area of McDonald County came across a cave. A sinkhole, really, in a remote location about 10 miles from Rowan's home. Inside, hidden beneath leaves and debris, he found a body. It was Rowan. She was nude from the waist down, wearing only one sock. Her small body was in an advanced stage of decomposition after 6 days exposed to the elements. There was a ligature mark around her neck and there were injuries to her genital area that told a story of sexual violence. The autopsy would confirm what investigators already suspected. Rowan had been raped. She had been strangled to death. The little girl who loved Hannah Montana, who rode her purple bicycle through Stella, who kept that Bible verse about light shining through darkness, had died in terror and pain. Within hours of finding Rowan's body, police arrested both Christopher Collings and David Spears. They were each charged with 1 count of first-degree murder, 1 count of forcible rape, and 1 count of statutory rape. In the interrogation rooms, both men eventually confessed to their involvement in Rowan's murder, though the details of their confessions would conflict in troubling ways. Christopher Collings admitted to the crime in detail. He described how he'd raced to beat Spears back to the house that night, how he'd taken sleeping Rowan from her home and driven her to his trailer. He confessed to raping her. He explained that when she recognized him in the moonlight, he panicked and strangled her with the chicken house rope. He told investigators where he'd disposed of her body and what he'd burned to destroy evidence. David Spears also gave a statement, but his version of events was different. In a transcript of Spears' statement to police, he claimed that Collings handed him the cord and that he, Spears, had killed Rowan. However, Collings' more detailed confession denied that Spears was present during the actual murder. The conflicting accounts raised questions about what truly happened and who bore what level of responsibility. What was clear was this: both men had been there that night. Both had been drinking heavily. Both had abandoned Rowan, leaving her alone and vulnerable. And both would face consequences for their actions, though those consequences would be very different. Immediately after the arrests, Colleen Munson filed for divorce from David Spears. Her daughter was dead, and her husband was one of the men charged with killing her. The betrayal was complete. The news of Rowan's murder sent shockwaves through Stella and the surrounding communities. This wasn't supposed to happen in a small town, where everyone knew everyone. Children were supposed to be safe here. A funeral service was scheduled for Wednesday, November 14th at Gospel Lighthouse Church in Neosho, Missouri. The morning before the funeral, teachers and students at Triway Elementary School gathered for a memorial. They planted a pink dogwood tree in Rowan's honor, a tree that would bloom every spring as a reminder of the little girl they'd lost. Students released purple balloons into the sky, each balloon carrying a note from one of Rowan's classmates. A concrete angel was placed at the site, along with a marker that read April 11, 1998, for the day she was born, and November 9th, 2007. As the day her body was found, Todd Holt, Rowan's 4th grade teacher, couldn't bring himself to clear out her desk. He left it untouched for days because removing her belongings would make her death too real. Years later, he would still remember exactly where Rowan had been sitting the day she went missing, exactly where her desk had been the day they found out she was gone. She's the kind of kid that I think every school teacher could want, Holt testified at trial. I mean, she showed up at school, and it was all about work. It was all about what Rowan was going to do to be able to get ahead in life. Another teacher remembered her simply, she was just a little ray of sunshine, just the sweetest girl you would ever meet. The funeral itself was attended by hundreds of people from Stella and neighboring towns. Reverend Glenn Ennis and Steve Moser officiated. Rowan's brothers, James and Robert, served as pallbearers alongside other family members. She was buried at Macedonia Cemetery in Stella, not far from the roads where she used to ride her bicycle. For Rowan's mother, Colleen, the grief was overwhelming and unending. During testimony at Christopher Collings' trial, she described her life after Rowan's death. "There's not much of a life," she said. "I cry a lot." She revealed that she'd been admitted to psychiatric care multiple times, unable to cope with the loss of her daughter. "It was 6 months after Rowan was found, and I just couldn't take any more," she testified. "I've been in the hospital a couple of times. I'm under psychiatric care right now, trying to get my life back to a simple something of a life." Ariane Parsons, Rowan's older sister, who was 18 at the time, testified that she collapsed to the floor when she heard her sister had been killed. The youngest of 5 siblings, Rowan had been the baby everyone looked after and loved. Now she was gone, and the family would never be whole again. In May 2008, prosecutors announced their intention to seek the death penalty for both Christopher Collings and David Spears. Both men pleaded not guilty to the charges against them, due to the extensive publicity surrounding the case. Both defendants were granted a change of venue. They would stand trial separately. Collings' trial was held in Phelps County, while Spears' trial took place in Barry County. Collings waived his right to a preliminary hearing and proceeded straight to trial. The case against him was built largely on his own confession and the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene and his trailer. The prosecution presented the autopsy photographs, gruesome images that showed the injuries Rowan had sustained. They called witnesses who testified about Collings' behavior in the days after Rowan's disappearance. One key witness was Clinton Clark, the Wheaton chief of police, who had known Collings for 17 years. Clark testified about interactions with Collings during the investigation. However, the defense would later argue that Clark's credibility was compromised because prosecutors had withheld information about Clark's criminal record from his military service during the Vietnam War. This would become a central point in Collings' appeals. The prosecution demonstrated how long it would have taken to strangle Rowan, holding the position for the jury to understand the deliberate nature of the act. They argued that Collings had raped Rowan and then killed her to prevent her from identifying him as her attacker. In the defense's case, Collings' attorneys presented evidence of his troubled childhood. They argued that he suffered from a brain abnormality that caused functional deficits in awareness, judgment, and emotional regulation. They claimed he'd experienced abuse and sexual abuse during his own childhood. They portrayed him as a man whose past trauma had led him to commit this terrible act. But the jury wasn't swayed by these mitigating factors. In 2012, Christopher Leroy Collings was found guilty of first-degree murder. The jury recommended the death penalty, and the judge agreed. Collings was sentenced to death by lethal injection. David Spears' case took a different turn. Rather than face trial and the potential death penalty, Spears accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to child endangerment and hindering prosecution, acknowledging his role in leaving Rowan alone and helping to cover up the crime. In exchange, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison, a fraction of what he might have faced if convicted of murder. This disparity in sentences angered many who believed Spears bore equal responsibility for Rowan's death. His own statement to police had implicated him more directly, claiming he'd been the one to kill her. Yet he received a relatively light sentence while Collings was sent to death row. After his conviction, Christopher Collings began the lengthy appeals process that's standard in death penalty cases. His attorneys filed multiple appeals with the Missouri Supreme Court, arguing various points of law and procedure. They argued that Collings had received ineffective assistance of counsel during his trial. They claimed that prosecutors had withheld evidence about Clinton Clark's credibility, specifically his criminal convictions related to his military service. They argued that this violated Collings' right to a fair trial because Clark was a key witness whose testimony had been central to the prosecution's case. The Missouri Supreme Court reviewed these arguments carefully, as they do with all death penalty appeals. In March 2018, the court unanimously rejected Collings' arguments and upheld both his conviction and his death sentence. The judges found that even if Clark's military service record had been made available to the defense, it would not have changed the outcome of the case. The evidence against Collings was simply too strong. Collings filed additional appeals, including a writ of habeas corpus, each time hoping to present new evidence or arguments that might overturn his conviction or at least commute his sentence to life in prison. Each appeal was denied. In August 2024, the Missouri Supreme Court took a significant step. They scheduled Christopher Collings' execution for December 3, 2024. At 6 o'clock in the evening, after 17 years on death row, Collings would finally face the ultimate consequence for his crime. As the execution date approached, Collings' attorneys made their final pleas for mercy. They filed a clemency petition with Missouri Governor Mike Parson, asking him to commute Collings' sentence to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The petition reiterated arguments about Collings' brain abnormality and his troubled childhood. It emphasized that he had suffered abuse and neglect that had shaped him into the man who committed this terrible crime. His lawyers argued that these factors should be considered in deciding whether he deserved to die. The Missouri Catholic Conference also urged Governor Parson to grant clemency, arguing that capital punishment violated the sanctity and dignity of human life, regardless of the crime committed. Governor Parson reviewed the petition carefully. On December 2, 2024, the day before the scheduled execution, he issued his decision. He would not grant clemency. Mr. Collings has received every protection afforded by the Missouri and United States Constitutions, Parson said in his statement, and Mr. Collings' conviction and sentence remain for his horrendous and callous crime. The state of Missouri will carry out Ms. Collings' sentence according to the court's order and deliver justice. That same day, Collings' attorneys filed one final emergency appeal with the United States Supreme Court, hoping the nation's highest court would intervene and stay the execution. They argued the same points about ineffective counsel and withheld evidence. The Supreme Court reviewed the appeal and made their decision quickly. They denied it. Christopher Collings' execution would proceed as scheduled. On the evening of December 3, 2024, Christopher Leroy Collings was transferred to the execution chamber at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri. He was 49 years old, having spent 17 years on death row. For his final meal, Collings requested a bacon cheeseburger, breaded mushrooms, tater tots, and a chef's salad. It was a simple meal for his last hours. His spiritual advisor, Reverend Dr. Kristen Leslie, was with him during his final moments. Collings had prepared written final words, which were released after his death. Right or wrong, I accept this situation for what it is, he wrote. It was a statement that acknowledged his fate without expressing remorse to Rowan's family. Outside the correctional center, 44 people gathered to protest the death penalty. They held signs and candles, praying and demonstrating their opposition to state-sanctioned execution. For them, the issue wasn't whether Collings was guilty, but whether the government should have the power to take a life, even the life of someone who had committed such a horrible crime. Inside the death chamber, witnesses gathered to watch the execution. Among them was Colleen Minson, Rowan's mother. After 17 years of waiting, she would see the man who had murdered her daughter take his final breath. Collins was strapped to a gurney. An IV line was inserted into his arm. At the appointed time, a single dose of pentobarbital, a powerful barbiturate, was administered. The drug works quickly, first causing unconsciousness, then respiratory depression, and finally cardiac arrest. At 6:10 p.m. Central Standard Time, Christopher Leroy Collings was pronounced dead. The execution was the 23rd in the United States that year and the 4th in Missouri. Only Alabama and Texas had conducted more executions in 2024. The murder of Rowan Ford had a profound impact on everyone connected to the case, effects that lasted long after the execution. Former Berry County Sheriff Mick Epperly, who had originally investigated the murder in 2007, stated that it was the most unforgettable case he'd come across in his entire law enforcement career. Collings deserved to be sentenced to death for the rape and murder of the girl, Epperly said in response to the execution. Newton County Sheriff Chris Jennings, who had been involved in the initial search for Rowan, said he'd waited for this day for 17 years. I still carry her picture with me, Jennings revealed. I've worked hundreds of homicides, and this one will always stay with me. For Rowan's family, the execution brought a measure of closure, though it could never truly heal the wound her death had created. Ariane Max, Rowan's older sister, who was now 35 years old, spoke about wanting Collings dead, but feeling that lethal injection was too easy a death for what he'd done. I cannot even imagine the pain when Rowan was strangled, she said. Chris being so tall and so big compared to my little sister. She didn't have a fighting chance. The case also raised questions about the criminal justice system. In 2025, it was revealed that David Spears, after serving his sentence and being released from prison, had been hired by the Missouri State Public Defender's Office. The news sparked outrage among state lawmakers and community members. How could someone who had pleaded guilty to child endangerment in connection with Rowan's murder be working in the justice system? Missouri lawmakers demanded Spears' termination, arguing that while they believed in second chances, there were clear and reasonable limits, especially when it came to those who had been involved in such a heinous crime. The controversy led the Public Defender Commission to review their employee background check policies. The community of Stella never forgot Rowan. In April 2025, on what would have been her 27th birthday, a bench was dedicated in her memory. It sits somewhere in that small town where she used to ride her purple bicycle, a permanent reminder of the little girl with the bright smile and the dedication to her schoolwork and her faith. In the years since her death, Rowan Ford has been remembered not for how she died, but for how she lived. Those who knew her recall her as a hard-working student, a faithful church attendee, and a beloved sister and daughter. She was 9 years old when her life was stolen from her, but in those 9 years, she'd touched many lives. The pink dogwood tree planted at Triway Elementary School continues to bloom each spring. The concrete angel and memorial marker remain at the school, a place where Rowan was happy and felt safe. The bookmark she kept in her Bible, the one with John 1:5, carries a message that feels both painful and hopeful. The light shines through the darkness, and the darkness can never extinguish it. Rowan's light was extinguished far too soon, but her memory lives on in the people who loved her and the community that mourned her. Her case led to changes in how investigators approach child abduction cases in Missouri. It served as a reminder that danger can come from the most unexpected places, from people we trust, from those we invite into our homes. The tragedy of Rowan Ford is a story about the worst of humanity, about betrayal and violence and the destruction of innocence. But it's also a story about a community that came together, about investigators who never gave up, and about a family that continues to honor a little girl who loved Hannah Montana, who rode her purple bicycle through small-town streets, and who kept a Bible verse about light conquering darkness close to her heart. In 2019, a book was published titled Lost Angels: The Murders of Rowan Ford and Doug Ringler, documenting Rowan's case alongside another tragedy that had shocked the region. The book serves as a record of what happened and a memorial to the victims. Today, if you visit Stella, Missouri, you might see the places Rowan knew, the roads where she rode her bike, the cemetery where she's buried, the school where she studied so diligently, and if you visit in the spring, you'll see that pink dogwood tree in bloom, standing as a testament to a little girl whose life mattered, whose death changed a community, and whose memory will not be forgotten. The murder of Rowan Ford reminds us that evil exists in this world, that trust can be betrayed, and that innocence can be destroyed. But it also reminds us that justice, though sometimes delayed, can prevail, that communities can come together in the face of tragedy, that those who dedicate their lives to law enforcement carry the weight of cases like this forever, and that a little girl's light, though extinguished, continues to shine in the memories of those who loved her. Rest in peace, Rowan Damia Ford. April 11, 1998 to November 9, 2007. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.